Good afternoon and morning. Welcome to another webinar hosted by the America Europe Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation. My name is Esther Zalin-Adu and I will be moderating today's discussion. Before we start, I would like to mention a few words about the Chair. The America Europe Fund strives to be a platform that supports academic cooperation, exchanges, programs and research to disseminate and strengthen comparative knowledge of European and American societies. One initiative that supports our mission is the America Europe Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation, which aims to provide interdisciplinary research and expertise on regulatory developments in Europe and America with a focus on technology, innovation and international regulation. Through these activities, we promote opportunities for cooperation and dissemination among stakeholders across the Atlantic. In today's discussion, we are joined in Brussels by Ms. Nicole Bertolini, an Associate Policy Manager who's responsible for the Trade and Customs, Trade Facilitation Committees, and the Transatlantic EU-UK Task Force at the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU. Of course, in Washington, D.C., we have Mr. Eduardo Casale Nueges, who is a program assistant for the Digital Innovation Initiative at the Center for European Policy Analysis. In today's discussion, we'll actually center on the complicated but relevant world of critical minerals sourcing and production, particularly its saliency in the current geostrategic competition between the US and China. Crucially, these critical commodities will be at the forefront of powering next-gen innovation and, of course, the transition to sustainable energy solutions. Seeing this, it begs the question as to why these critical minerals have been subject to consistent supply chain vulnerabilities and competition, as seen in the aftermath of the global pandemic. So, to help us understand these trends and their implications from a transatlantic perspective, I would like to start the discussion by asking our panel, firstly, fundamentally, why are critical minerals so central in our modern economy? We'll start with Mikko and then Eduardo.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot also for inviting me. I hope you can hear me well. I've been having some technical issues, so please stop me at any time. So why critical minerals are important? I think at this point in time, this question has been answered multiple times, in the sense that we have been seeing and finally realized how important these minerals are once facing both the digital and green transition. There's much more awareness nowadays on the importance of these minerals into, batteries, for instance, solar panels, but also our cell phones. So I think the moment we start facing some supply chain issues or disruptions, that's where these understanding of the criticality of these critical minerals has started. I think apart from understanding how important they are, I think it was also a better awareness, we found a better awareness on how strategic they are. So not just the importance in certain products that we use every day and they're gonna drive us through, let's say, the future, but also how important, let's say, with respect to a geopolitical situation that we're facing, they are critical, and how strategic they are with respect to certain, again, geopolitical tensions that we are living through right now. Or not even just that, I think, for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic showed that besides geopolitical tensions, the fact that we are in a globalized world where if there is a bottleneck somewhere in the supply chain, everyone else actually is going to suffer from that, and the entire chain is going to be affected. That's where the strategic also element started to come into the reasoning. So yeah, just again to sum up, these critical minerals have not been critical from today. I think right now there's a much better awareness also of their strategic elements and importance for the transition that we're trying to go through.
Wonderful. Eduardo?
Thank you, and thank you to KU11 for hosting this excellent panel. As Mikko very rightly pointed out, the critical minerals are where we need to power the digital transition, the green transition. Then there's another element to it, which I think is also what is most concerning here in Washington, D.C., which is the national infrastructure industrial base. when you talk about producing items like heavy machinery, when you talk about producing vehicles that are elementary and necessary to the operations of defense policy, when you talk about producing missiles, even night vision goggles, they are powered by very specific rare earth elements and critical minerals that we currently either have very limited access to, no access to, or access to with huge dependencies on our strategic rivals. Miko very rightly pointed out at the importance of the COVID-19 supply chain crisis on the impact that it had on our awareness of our dependencies and these issues. We saw chips as the base of, oh, you know, with chips, without chips, we cannot have phones, we cannot have cars, we cannot have AI, we cannot have any of these elements that are so necessary in our daily lives. But critical minerals are what we need to produce these very chips. So if you think if you think as chips as what powers the world, critical minerals are the base from which you build those chips and everything else. It is truly one of those elements that people have been warning about for quite some time, that people have been calling for supply chain diversification for decades, and no action has been taken for quite some time. So at least it is good news that legislators on both sides of the Atlantic are starting to consider this issue. And hopefully in the upcoming 2024-2028 Transatlantic agenda, we will see a stronger focus on this issue.
Wonderful. And that actually connects to my next question, which is currently who or how many countries actually currently dominate the global critical mineral supply chains? And could you also tell us more on how did this actually occur? Like what were the particular processes or factors that were taken into place that led to these kind of concentrations? We'll start with Eduardo and then Nicole.
Certainly, the answer is not many, surprisingly. It also depends vastly on which stage of the supply chain we're looking at. When we talk about critical minerals, we tend to think of only the extraction process. How do you get the minerals off the ground and into the road? But there's actually a much more important element to that. When you look at the extraction elements, you see countries like, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, Angola, Bolivia, Chile, and those are the ones that are most important for the mining of very specific elements such as copper, cobalt, or lithium. The part of the supply chain that is actually most exposed to geopolitical risk right now is not necessarily that, so much as it is the refinery part. The refinery, to put it in commercial terms, is where we clean up the mineral through electrolysis and hydrolysis. We get rid of all the impurities in that material, and we make it ready to be implemented into a commercial process. And when you look at that part of the supply chain, China dominates enormously. So much so that 98% of the critical minerals that the EU consumes come directly from China because of this part. For the US, it's less, it's 57%, but it's still extremely high. So the answer to that is it depends vastly on which stage of the supply chain. But it is concerning that the countries that are taking on the more risk, which is the extraction part, are not the countries that are benefiting the most. Electrolysis and hydrolysis are the most value-added part of the supply chain, and China has very strategically positioned itself in a way in which they're getting all of the funding from this part of the process, leaving these developing countries with only the more rudimentary and more dangerous part of the supply chain.
And Miko, your thoughts?
Yes, maybe to add, especially on this aspect of the supply chain and the value chain and the differences in dominance in there, it's also important to keep in mind dominance in terms of intermediary and final products. And here again, China is definitely dominant. But another element or aspect that I find interesting in this discussion is how we got there in this dominance. Because obviously, like looking at some of the countries that were mentioned by Eduardo in terms especially of extraction, you have a natural resources element, like an advantage from a natural resources standpoint. But another element that definitely made a difference at a certain point in time is also like strategic investment, for instance, and state support. And that's exactly where, for instance, you see China dominating, and not just in China, so not just in the mainland, but also in other countries. You see increasingly China being aggressive, or like having an aggressive, like going out kind of policy since a while right now. Obviously supported heavily by like state subsidies and support, or like through SOEs, directly, but also a very strong technological and processing capabilities, as mentioned by Eduardo. For instance, what I find interesting, China really focuses a lot on a vertically integrated model, for instance, where you have, as mentioned by Eduardo, not just extraction, but also the processing and refining capacities. So just in a nutshell, also, I find it interesting to analyze, beside obviously a much, let's say, longer discussion on like historic reasons, colonialism, which is definitely something also that shouldn't be forgotten, of why we got here and how we got here, but also important to reflect how this dominance was created, which would allow us also to, let's say, find ways to address this dominance and the risks that it entails sometimes.
Wonderful. So, Eduardo and Nicole, you already touched upon the issue of dominance and dependencies, and especially Eduardo mentioned how a lot of the countries in the extractive industries are not part of the value-added chain. So, from your view, especially in the US and here in Brussels, Nicole, what were the consequences, would you say, particularly of these kind of dependencies? And if you like, you can also highlight particular industries or recent trends that you foresee. We'll start with Nicole and then Eduardo.
Yeah, of course. I think there's many challenges that this dominance entails. The first, as I already mentioned, is a supply chain kind of vulnerability because of this market concentration that Eduardo also mentioned. That definitely entails a very high economic risk in the moment there is a bottleneck or anything outside also of the political considerations, as I mentioned. There's also an issue of market volatility and price fluctuation that is also relevant for the industry and makes it constantly unstable as an environment to navigate. But then obviously I think at the forefront of the discussion right now, it's really the geopolitical risk, and especially the kind of strategic leverage that dominance provides a country, in particular China. I think especially this economic, let's say, leverage, strategic leverage, is really what started to raise concerns among other countries. I think of the case, for instance, of 2010 and the China-Japan rare earth situations, and especially the sort of economic coercion or weaponization of these critical minerals that we see happening more and more, even recently with the germanium, I think, in gallium, always from China. So that's definitely something that is on top of mind and is really pushing to rethinking our dependencies, our over-reliance. But also, just maybe to conclude, I think there's also another element to think about in terms of like this dominance is a competitiveness element as well. Like the moment you have such, again, vulnerabilities and over-reliance on a specific country or region, that obviously may affect your, let's say, manufacturing competitiveness, among others, but also your innovation capacity for the future, your competition and the competitiveness really overall. And I think just another element that I wanted to add, a little like outside of the dominance kind of discussion, but it's also growing more and more in terms of like creating issues in this critical minerals discussion, is also like the fragmentation that we see in terms of policy, for instance, or approaches to critical minerals and to these vulnerabilities, to this dominance, but also regulatory differences inside specific countries like the EU. I'm happy to build more on that. So all these elements, I think, in my view, really are contributing to like bring it to the forefront this dominance and over-reliance issue.
Eduardo, your thoughts?
I couldn't put it even more perfectly at all. That's a perfect description of the situation. And China has positioned itself very, very aggressively to ensure that that not just other countries, but that the United States and that the European Union's industries would be impossible to advance any further without their own exports. I think that China understood from the very beginning of the 1980s the power that these minerals were going to have. They understood very well the necessity that we were going to have for them in the years ahead, and they very wisely positioned themselves in a situation where they control the entire supply chain. The consequence of that, and there's a fantastic report by the Boston Consulting Group on this, is we are right now in a very high, we're coming out of it, but in a very high inflationary period. And when it comes, you have seen a number of central banks cutting interest rates, hiding interest rates, trying to address this inflation. But there's an underlying price hike which we haven't been able to address, which is caused by this domination. Is if we are not able to secure our own sources of critical minerals, refined critical minerals, we will continue to see very expensive electric vehicles. We will continue to see very expensive electric bikes. We will continue to see very expensive heavy machinery, computers. Think of all of it. So the price hike element is definitely one of those most concerning elements. The other big one is the fact that because we have been relying on China for such a long time, the United States and the European Union have not. We have developed industries on these sectors, but they're nowhere as advanced as they should be. In the European Union, I believe there are no more than around 50. There are around 50 mines for the critical minerals. We even talk even less about the refinery capacity for those minerals that would be exported to China. So that's one of the most deafening elements, is that we do not have the companies that are able to do this. We do not have the staff and the expertise that is able to do this. And we do not have the investment infrastructure to facilitate private equity banks investing in these sectors. In the US, it's even more concerning. The legislation that governs the use of land in the United States is extremely prohibitive to mining, to creating new mines, and to creating new refineries. So it's a sector that we had completely forgotten about for a number of years, and that we need to seriously reconsider the entire infrastructure environment around it if we want to restart it.
Wonderful. So Mikkel and Eduardo already touched upon some of the kind of domestic national security concerns, but also the dependency, how some of these sectors were kind of neglected, especially in terms of mining capacity. So fundamentally, and also more concretely, if you could give examples, what has been the response to these dependencies, especially on the EU and US side? This could be in terms of regulatory tools to financial incentives and so forth. We'll start with Mikkel and then Eduardo.
Yes, I can comment on the EU side and leave Eduardo to more like the US side. So what happens on the EU side? I think overall we're going to the right direction in the way the EU is responding to these challenges. First and foremost, because the EU put forward a critical raw materials act, so like a fully fledged strategy basically, and also obviously regulatory framework as well, let's say, to a certain extent, to really address all these vulnerabilities issues. And it's a smart mix, let's say, of initiatives and policies, in the sense that it tries to tackle three main, let's say, pillars, like to tackle this issue through three main pillars. The first one being diversification of supply chain, obviously. So not just through access new sources, and this is more like, let's say, the trade policy, aggressive trade policy that the US has been trying to put forward in these last years, but also a big focus on recycling, for instance, reuse, so the secondary, let's say, raw materials element. So also trying to incentivize investment in recycling infrastructure, R&D, and so on. There's also a focus on the domestic production, as mentioned, the mining and refining element. Exactly as Eduardo said, I was also surprised to discover that the EU is basically lagging behind 15 years with respect to China when it comes to mining alone. So that's definitely huge with respect to the challenges and respect to the demand, especially for some of these critical minerals that we are going to face in the next years. So the EU is trying through sort of like strategic partnership or strategic projects to, let's say, speed up permitting, for instance, access to funding and financing overall. So that's definitely something positive that we see inside of the EU. And then especially there's an external element, as I mentioned, the more strategic partnership elements outside of the FTA or trade agreements overall, which is more really trying to create certain frameworks of dialogue and cooperation with some key countries. I mean, I think, for instance, since we are talking about the EU and the US, the Trade and Technology Council can actually fall under this framework, but also this discussion, but also a wide number of memorandum of understanding that the EU has been signing. The most recently with Australia, for instance, exactly to work on the strengthening of the supply chains, but also working together towards more responsible sourcing or like more sustainable management of critical minerals and so on, with the idea in mind, say, of creating a sort of like critical mineral club overall. So that is one side, like the more proactive, let's say, strategic side. On the other side as well, since we mentioned some of these challenges coming from China, for instance, like coercion and things like that, the EU has also put together in this last mandate a series of autonomous trade tools, as they're basically called, to try to shield the European markets and European producers in particular from these potentially aggressive weaponization of China of these critical minerals. An example is the anti-coercion instruments, which is exactly there to address these economic coercion situations, like the one with Japan, and many, many others, like foreign subsidies, regulation, international procurement instruments. There's a very big toolbox that is there to be used. And the last one also that I wanted to point out is WTO, so the World Trade Organization, which I know it's a big debate whether this is still a working organization, a functional organization or not, but it still remains a very important point of reference for the European Union when it comes to settlement to address some of these issues, especially export restriction issues that sometimes we face with critical minerals. Thinking of like Indonesia, for instance, with nickel pretty recently. So yeah, this is really in a nutshell some of the tools that they use putting forward to address some of these challenges.
Okay, Eduardo, your thoughts?
On the US side, things have been angled very differently from the EU side. But I must say, from this side of the Atlantic, it is wonderful to see the European Union taking it so seriously and passing significant legislation on it. On the US side, we haven't had a Critical Raw Materials Act per se, at least as of recent. We did have the Inflation Reduction Act, despite its transatlantic controversy. But that was the main source of funding for many critical minerals projects in the United States, and it was also the starter of a broader conversation on securing these minerals within the United States supply chain. From that use, we saw a three-pronged approach. The first one was by the United States Department of Defense. In 2022, the White House asked the Department of Defense to conduct basically an audit of the critical mineral supply chain and seeing just how exposed the United States was to China and to other strategic rivals. It's a 100-page report, but the answer is basically very much. And they have been planning their own stockpiles since 2022 until today, basically accumulating massive amounts of copper, cobalt, and a number of other critical minerals specifically to them. This is completely separate from the civilian angle. On the civilian angle, the Department of Energy has been leading. They have issued over 2.8 billion in research grants, in funding, in very specific loan projects. And the idea is that they're covering for part of the cost of certain mines. They're covering for the cost of certain refineries, not entirely, but enough to promote more private investment to go in. And at the same time, what the Department of Energy is doing, which I think is very interesting, is they're trying to regenerate the creative and the industry element around it. So a number of these funds are going to research centers, they're going to research facilities, they're going to universities, they're going to training workers in state schools, and they're going to a number of projects that are aimed at creating an ecosystem that will allow the industry to thrive. Because otherwise, if we're just mining down to the ground, but we don't have miners, we don't have trucks, and we don't have any of those materials, it would be an incomplete approach. So it's not sufficient funds, of course, and of course, this is something that's going to require legislative changes on the use of land to do anything further. But it is a very good first step into it. Of course, depending on who's elected in November, you will see there are more environmentally conscious or more pro-business approach to it. The last prong approach to it is what Mikko went into, the strategic partnerships element to it. This flew very much under the radar for quite some time, but the United States and the European Union together are building a rail line from the port of Lobito in Angola through Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, basically connecting the production points of certain productions of of copper and cobalt. And the idea is to link all of these mines together to the port of Lobito with refineries spread it throughout the rail line and get them to the United States and the European Union. And this is out of a recognition that we do not have the costing abilities to mine some of this product. It is incredibly expensive to do so in the United States, as is in the European Union. So we have to be able to go to a market and think in a business perspective of, oh, this is cheaper. And also, China has been doing this for a really, really long time. They have been doing so in a way that has used predatory economics to basically debt trap these countries into terrible arrangements for themselves. What the US is doing is showcasing American leadership, going to Angola, going to Zambia, going to the DRC, and saying, we're not just going to extract your minerals, we're going to refine them in your country, we're going to make education investments, we're going to export your agricultural products to the United States, and we're going to build up 5G telecom towers in the area. And that, in my opinion, has been the strongest approach so far. It needs to be written down in an actual strategy, but so far that approach has been the most efficient one.
Wonderful. In fact, this actually leads to my next point, because it's very clear that both panelists kind of hinted at the EU, US, and China strategic competition that is currently going on, especially as it relates to critical minerals. So in your perspective, how has this geostrategic competition, especially much more broadly in other areas, but specifically in this area of critical minerals, kind of influenced their respective responses? And if you want, you can also refer to concrete examples or kind of particular theories or trends that you see could be relevant to this question. We'll start with Eduardo and then Nicole.
Certainly. In the case of the United States, it has been completely shaped by the China angle. Washington is, I wouldn't say obsessed, but it is quite focused on the Chinese threat, and every issue of economic policy or trade policy is angled from the China policy perspective. When the Department of Defense first conducted their supply chain audit, the reason why they were conducting is because they wanted to see just how exposed the supply chain was to China. And again, it was very much exposed to China. So when you see any policy coming in from the United States, there is usually a number of different reasons why they're doing it. First, because they want to reduce dependency on China, but also US electoral politics play a huge role. Most of these mines and refineries are going to be located in very strategic states, very strategic counties. So there are also ways to foment political leadership in those areas. But I would say that you have the China element to it. And then there's also another element to it, which is the recognition that a vast part of the American population has not been advancing with globalization. And we need to make sure that those people are caught up. Doesn't matter if you're talking to Democrats supporting Joe Biden or Republicans supporting Donald Trump. That is a recognition on both sides of the aisle at the moment, bringing back production, ensuring that the United States will have enough materials to sustain its own industry and its own supply chains, even if perhaps not economically sustainable in the long term, is the political goal of the moment. And that's what they're aiming to do right now.
And Nicole, your thoughts?
Yes, I think on the EU side is slightly different in the sense, of course, China is on top of minds of everyone and remains a very important, let's say, actor in this equation. But all the reflection on critical minerals in Europe was mostly alimented by the green transition and the Green Deal initiatives that were put forward during this last Monday, and the realization of the importance of certain minerals for this green transition. And then from there, the realization of all these dependencies and the need to address them to support this green transition in the long term. So that's definitely the first one that's first element or most important element that is really supporting this discussion. But then I think overall, just to go through the realization of the need to work with others as well, which is another element of this discussion. I think there's also the understanding of everyone needs these critical minerals. And we are competing against each other, basically trying to obtain the same things or achieve the same objective. But at the same time, we are also facing the same challenges with respect, in particular, with China when it comes to more like-minded countries. So from here, the necessity to actually work together to address the competition among each other that is just detrimental in the end of the day, and instead trying to have an approach that leverages our complementarity or common resources, let's say, to address again these common challenges in a way that again, towards our digital green transitions, but also domestic industries in an equal, let's say, or complementary way.
Indeed, common challenges, but also competition. And that actually leads to the operative question of today's webinar, which is it time for a transatlantic strategy to secure critical minerals? We'll start with Nicole and then Eduardo.
I think it's definitely time. It's obviously a very rhetorical question. There is definitely a lot that EU and US can do together for reasons a little that we already explained more or less. The first being that the fact that we have common challenges with respect to China, as you mentioned, but also with respect to our digital and green transitions. The IRA, for instance, is definitely showing that the US also is willing to really jump into this green transition and make the most out of that. So we definitely share similar objectives, not fully same interest sometimes. As mentioned already, like our approach for China to the risks coming from China, the protection that we want to implement with respect to our domestic industry is different. So, but apart from that, again, we still share very fundamental, substantial challenges that we need to face together, as it's just like the smarter, more efficient, more strategic way to go. I think there's also an element that requires EU-US cooperation, which is having a technological and industrial leadership. As mentioned, to my point of competition among like-minded countries. Instead, what we should be doing with the EU and the US is to leverage, let's say, our technological industrial potential together. And the last point, which is sometimes neglected and it didn't come out yet in this discussion, is also the leadership that the US can have together on standards, and not just like more technical standards, let's say, but also and especially environmental and social and human rights, everything, standards, governance standards as well. So everything that is, for instance, under the umbrella of responsible sourcing or like sustainable management of resources and things like that. There's definitely a role there for the US to play together with respect to third countries, not obviously in an imposing way, but like in a collaborative way, supporting together third countries and especially developing countries in reaching this standard. So yeah, just in a nutshell, those are like three, I would say, of the elements where we can definitely work together and where we need to work together at this point.
Wonderful. Eduardo, your thoughts?
Very much like Nicole. Yes, it is time. It was time, I believe, many years ago to get agreeing on this. TTIP could have provided a good way to do so. Sadly, it never came to be. But and for those of the audience who haven't seen it, Mikko participated in a panel organized by SIPA and the Wilfred Martin Center about the Trade and Technology Council, and that is what I believe would be the ideal body to coordinate this. I mean, the body was literally created so that the United States Department of Commerce, USTR, and State Department would be able to work with DG Trade, DG Connect, and all of the other Director Generals of the European Commission to agree on these standards, and so that we would be able to have an agreement on these issues. When you look at the US list of critical minerals and at the EU list of critical minerals, there's, I believe it's either 23 or 24, but there's only 24 minerals that coincide. The US has other 50 minerals that it perceives to be in its national security that are not shared by the EU. So that's one of the first things that should be addressed. What do we consider as critical to our supply chain, and what do we need to prioritize? If we don't want to look at the TTC, there's other forums such as the Mineral Security Partnership. It was supposed to be a common buyers club to ensure that we were able to grow our mutual industries. I believe it is in the strategic interest of the United States and of the European Union to ensure that our industries are advancing hand in hand, competing, in a healthy level between each other, but not competing at the level of, let's see who gets the most subsidies to its industries. I will admit that it is quite unlikely that we will get a critical minerals agreement by the end of the year. We've just had elections to the European Parliament, so it is very unlikely that we will have a unified trade position to negotiate. Within the United States, it is virtually unimaginable to sign a trade agreement before the November election. But one of the things that we could be looking at is planning for contingencies. is what happens if we, for whatever reason, we are not able to do so in the years ahead. There are other mechanisms other than a free trade agreement to ensure that this can be done. For example, we could be doing special economic zones in certain ports and in certain fabrication areas to ensure that minerals extracted and refined in the US would be tariff-free in the EU and vice versa. It might be politically toxic to say this in the current environment, but it is necessary if we want to build competitive industries and if we want to really de-risk our supply chains from China. We need to start taking this seriously, and we need to go away from the politicking into real supply chain response for our industry.
And maybe
Wonderful. Yes.
and just to complement a little also what Eduardo said, and potentially also anticipating what your next question might be, is exactly on what EU-US can actually do together, should be doing together to cooperate on this challenge. Another couple of elements that I wanted to add is also on the trade side is really to commit or find a way to eliminate at a certain point export restrictions as much as possible and collaborate on trade facilitation without necessarily entering the discussion of market access, which definitely take at this point in time on the US side, but at least finding ways to facilitate trade of minerals, but also intermediate and final products between the EU and the US. That seems to me obviously a must. Another thing that as AmCham EU we are strongly calling for is joint investment and financing. There's a lot that could be done there. For instance, just joint extractions or processing ventures, leveraging some of these already existing frameworks that Eduardo mentioned, also Global Gateway or other frameworks that are existent. Another element that I find particularly important and should be leveraged more sometimes is research and development or research and innovation collaboration. On this, for instance, I heard somewhere, read somewhere, this idea of innovation hub between the EU and the US. That's definitely something that would be worth exploring. Again, in this idea of leveraging complementarity that we might have, and especially on the recycling, let's say, or even just to try to find more sustainable mining approaches that or models that would definitely be something important to work together on. Together, obviously, also with third countries, indeed. And another important couple of things is regulatory cooperation. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we do have an issue with fragmentation also from a regulatory policy standpoint. We have too many policies and regulations between markets that differ and widely, but also internal in the same market. Like an example that always strikes me is the European Union, where you have many different objectives, many different policies that are not coherent with one another right now. I think the chemical policy, for instance, is going in a direction it's completely harming sometimes what actually the green policy objectives are. So there is need for overall coherence, policy coherence, but also alignment between policies and regulations among markets, and especially the EU-US being the first ones to come into mind. And very last element that you mentioned, Eduardo, and I find also particularly interesting and not talked about too much in the EU is stockpiling, strategic stockpiling. You're right in reminding us that we are not just looking at green and digital products here, but also still more, let's say, traditional national security related sectors like defense and security. So why not instead exploring more strategic stockpiling also exercises within the EU and US or with others, I don't know, under the NATO framework. I'm not sure this is something that is happening right now. I'm not a defense expert, but not sure this is already something that is ongoing. So just to put there a couple of additional elements to complement Eduardo's thought that could be worth exploring between the EU and the US.
Wonderful. So Miguel and Eduardo clearly kind of already touch upon the potential as to why it's time for transatlantic strategy by pointing out that apart from trade agreements, different tools can be used, such as the special economic zones, cooperation, also research and development, joint mining. Also, that there's a need for leadership, especially at the US side. So seeing all of these potentials, what are actually the potential obstacles to a US-EU critical minerals agreement? Like why, as Eduardo stated early on, is it not possible to reach such an agreement by the end of 2024? We'll start with Eduardo and then Nicole.
Certainly on the US side, I mean, Miko was just talking about how it is necessary for to show some political leadership in the United States. That is actually the biggest impediment. The U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Catherine Tai, who's a very skilled trade negotiator, signed a critical minerals agreement with Japan and the United Kingdom without the express approval from Congress just a few months ago, because she generally believed, and a number of experts believe, that she did not need congressional approval. However, congressional leadership felt differently and felt like they were sidelined. So the idea that she would do so again with the European Union might cause her some serious political damage. And doing so from any other member of the cabinet could also be just as impactful. In the United States, the conversation about market access is even is getting shorter day by day, but there is an increasing appetite, especially at the private level, from industry, from some members of Congress, from diplomats, asking to genuinely take these negotiations seriously. The other big element that is a constraint on the US side is existing legislation. Miko was just talking about how the European Union has many different regulations amongst the member states, how that is policies are not necessarily always coordinated. That is also very true for the United States. We tend to forget that it is a federal government and that state governments have a huge amount of power when it comes to permitting reforms, when it comes to the use of land, and when it comes to other similar legislation. So in the United States, one of the things that we would need is actually a harmonization of the mining standards, of the land standards, of the permitting standards, of grant standards, to ensure that a company that is coming from, say, Germany, who wants to open a mine in the US, can do so in less than 10 years. Currently, getting a permit just to build the mine, just getting the permit, requires already 10 years and a high amount of fees. So we need to be looking at these things one by one, and what are the actual impediments to do so. But again, it will require a huge amount of political leadership from both the United States and the European Union, or again, to find alternative ways to a free trade agreement.
And Miko, your thoughts?
Yes, another couple of elements that I see that are blocking right now, apart from the political level, that is definitely the most important at the same time, as mentioned by Eduardo. I think we have to accept that EU-US have different national interests, and this is coming out very strongly in this discussion. We are both there to protect our industry, to protect our markets. We have also different economic and industrial policies and objectives. As I mentioned, the EU is very much oriented on green tech, or like this kind of green position. The US, for instance, when it comes to critical minerals, as mentioned by Eduardo, is much more focused on the military defense elements, energy security, energy independence kind of support. We have a different approach to China as well, and this also comes out in the way we are approaching this kind of discussion, which for the EU, for instance, is not necessarily anti-China, but for the US, sometimes it is. We have also undeniably different regulatory and policy environments, as already mentioned, but also in this package, I see a different approach to trade, more or less. Like our approaches to trade policy are really diverging, with the US really not inclined to have anything at the back, like market access, for instance, whereas the EU is really looking forward to something that facilitates trade and potentially brings market access into the mix, but that's definitely not an element of discussion. There's a strategic autonomy element as well that is always there in the background. So as I mentioned, like this national security element that comes out here and there in the discussion as well. And also, in the end of the day, we still have different standards on environments and labor in particular, and especially the labor one, I know was one of the elements blocking in the discussion. So there again, despite EU and the US having very similar standards, or like having similar ambitions when it comes to ESG, for instance, we still don't talk the same language. So there is a lot of work to also establish, I would say, trust between the EU and US in this process. Because despite all the work that has been going on between the EU and US to rebuild trust and dialogue after the Trump presidency through the Trade and Technology Council as an example, I sometimes don't have the impression that this trust is reflected in certain bilateral talks like critical minerals, but also the global agreement on sustainable steel and aluminium. So you see a lot of trust being built or dialogue going ahead somewhere at the TPC at a more superficial political level. But when it comes to the technicalities of it, or like the matters that really hard, like in this case, the critical minerals, trust doesn't look like it's there, because if we are arguing or not finding agreement on labor standards or environmental standards among two of the set countries, like block of countries with the highest standards in the world, it starts to be a very big issue also of trust and understanding each other on these standards, understanding some of the legal constraints that one of us has, like the EU in this case, not being able to do what the US wants in this agreement because of just legal reasons. So just again, in a nutshell, find another couple of elements in the mix that are really making this discussion difficult. And even though they're going to be on the top of the agenda in the next mandate for the US government, definitely we're not going to see anything before then, as Eduardo already mentioned.
And if I may jump in, Miko has very rightly pointed to the issue of trust between the US and the EU on a lack of reciprocation, but we also need to communicate that trust to the private sector. So we're asking, all of these companies, Anglo-American, Albemarle, we're asking all of these companies to make huge investments, like hundreds of millions worth of investments in having new mines throughout the United States and the European Union, as Miko was saying, with very high labor and environmental costs to them. And we're asking them to do so out of our national and our strategic interests. But what we have to remember is that China has had these investments for a really long time, and the dumping threat is very real. They can just drop the lithium and the cobalt wherever they want to at a very low price, which would make our own investments worthless. So we need also that level of trust. And on the US and the EU side, Miko very rightly pointed out to the issue that the US is trying to find its position on labor and environmental standards. I think we will see a definitive answer on that coming on in November. So hopefully the future negotiations will be much clearer to the Europeans and to our other partners and allies.
Wonderful. And that brings me to my final question. Let's say that the issue of trust, the divergence in regulatory standards, especially related to labor, environment, and so forth, suddenly gets a degree of consensus. So, and an agreement is reached. How likely would this agreement be actually enforced, especially looking at the current political economy and trends, especially in the critical markets industry? How do you foresee a possible agreement between the EU and US on critical mining and sourcing and production being actually enforced, especially at the private or public level? We'll start with Mikkel and then Eduardo.
Yeah, this is not an easy question, because exactly how can you enforce something you don't agree on in the first place? That's really the question. I think here, just on the point of Eduardo, potentially the role of the industry starts to be extremely relevant. If you have two countries or block of countries that are not able to agree on something, then you probably have a gap there that could be filled by the private sector, some voluntary, again, partnerships or like voluntary schemes as they already exist, voluntary joint, I don't know, ventures or things like that. So there is also their role for the private sector to play, and then from like potentially the bottom up, scale this up a more political level and show the EU and US that there is like a lot of willingness from like the private sector to go ahead with this in a certain way with a certain standard, of course, and with certain objectives. So definitely that's one thing. Another thing also I would say, to put pressure on the EU and US to finalize this, but also of course to commit to what is finalized, is definitely third countries. So the countries that are actually going to be impacted also to a certain extent by anything that the EU and US agree on when it comes to critical minerals. So the need for like accountability of the US with respect to these countries as well, bringing these countries into the mix, into the books as well, to make sure that these commitments are actually then realized on the ground. It's another element that I would think of, for instance.
Okay, Eduardo, your thoughts?
I think that's completely right, especially in the private sector side of things. Economic history teaches us that when countries decide to pick a national champion or a national sector, and they decide to launch a state-owned company that mines it or that does it, it typically doesn't go very well or very far. Typically, it's a bankruptcy in most cases, actually. So what we need is kind of what the Department of Energy is already doing, help these companies. And so how likely would it be enforced? Well, the first thing that we need is a framework that says we're not going to be doing this for state-owned companies. We're going to be supporting the existing industry, build up existing industry, and basically take away all of the risk that they have to ensure that they're able to do so with the most amount of comfortability possible. Alexander Hamilton, in the Report of Manufacturers, he writes about how the fear of failure is one of the only things preventing entrepreneurs and preventing companies from advancing forward. We need to reduce that fear of failure. That means eliminating regulatory barriers and red tape, as Mikko alluded to. That means putting in more money partially to fund those projects to avoid the threat of Chinese dumping. And as Mikko very rightly pointed out, we cannot do this just the United States and the European Union because, one, we don't have most of these minerals in our lands. We also don't have the refining capacity. We need to bring in Canada. We need to bring in Australia. And most importantly, we need to build on the Global Gateway project and the Blue Dot Network, but especially the Global Gateway, with projects like the Lobito Corridor that signify our aim for global leadership under democratic standards. You know, we have a compromise to all of these countries to ensure that you can get funding from the US and the European Union. You can get access to investment from US and EU companies, and getting that deal will be better than getting a loan from the Chinese infrastructure bank that will most likely drive later into bankruptcy. So we need to make that case very clear, and we need a verbal articulation of this compromise by the European Union and the US leaders.
Wonderful. And with that, that is the end of the discussion, but we'll enter in the Q&A. So for our audience, do you have any questions for our panelists? And in the meantime, I'll just begin the Q&A by asking, Nicole and Edward, you nicely touched upon throughout the discussion the role of private sector, but what influence or role do you think other multilateral regional platforms like Chamber of Commerce or associations could play a role in actually bringing the critical minerals partnership into reality, especially without the active involvement of the government or policy makers? We'll start with Eduardo and then Nicole.
That's a great question. I don't think we have paid enough attention to the regional players. I think ECOWAS could be a very active player. We do not have, well, there are attempts to have a free trade area in the African continent, but multiple efforts have failed in multiple different regions. ECOWAS is one of the only ones that has been quite successful in actually facilitating investment and trade among its different member states. So I think we should be working more closely with ECOWAS. And I think we should be, Mikko alluded also to stockpiling and wondered whether NATO would be a good actor. I think actually NATO would be a fantastic actor to coordinate the production and the stockpiling of critical minerals. We have to think of the issue from a holistic perspective, and including private sector, chambers of commerce, of course. And the other element, the research element is key, but also building the labor force that will be working in these mines in the European Union and the US is critical. We do not have miners. There's just not interest among the younger generation to do this. So we have to go to universities, we have to go to state colleges, city schools and such, and highlight how this is not going into a coal mine with a candlelight and with exposing yourself to health risks, how this is actually a very sustainable industry for the individual, how it is actually very well paid. And we need those educational efforts to make sure that we will have that. So thinking through it from the local level to the international level, we have to be interacting with as many actors as possible.
Okay. And Mikko, your thoughts? The role of private sector or other platforms?
On the private sector in particular, I don't think the best way is to leave the private sector go alone on this. I think the private sector should be brought in as a main partner in these, like in achieving all these objectives and addressing these challenges that we've been talking to right now, and not just in terms of projects, strategic products like this joint, I don't know, even innovation discussions or collaboration, but even also in the elaboration of or like implementation of standards or like environmental human rights, as already mentioned, they also have a very, very important role to play in that specific regard. But apart from like the industry, which again I see brought in every step of the way, and also just to add on the industry per se, there's also sometimes a rethinking how we involve the industry and at what point, in the sense of an idea could be to involve the more like downstream actors in more in the upstream also kind of discussion. I think, for instance, of Tesla, I think was getting engaged in like lithium refining or extraction at a certain point. Not sure which one of those, but like this is an example of instead of non-mining actors getting more and more active also in other streams of or like tiers of supply chains. So having like a more integration also in that sense of the more downstreams with upstreams, that could be definitely be an idea. But then outside of the industry as well, just to add on the multilateral also kind of discussion, I think WTO still has a role to play. There's no, as far as I know, precise framework on critical minerals. Like there's been a lot of discussion at certain points when Pascal Lamy was the director general, and that would be something already important potentially to work on to, for instance, address all these trade barriers that we mentioned, or find a common like recognition of what is a critical minerals, what is a strategic mineral, trying to address some of those divergences that we have, the fragmentation that we're facing. That could be another, let's say, element we would say to add to the mix, apart from like the more like on the ground business involvement as well.
Wonderful. And I think we'll just leave it there as we're reaching the end of today's discussion. But I would like to thank our panelists, Eduardo and Nicole, for their insights and expertise into this important but also ongoing discussion on the future of EU-US cooperation in critical mineral sourcing, production, and of course, later innovation. And I'd like to thank you, our audience, for your participation and questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't go through all of them, but I hope that maybe in the future we could have a part 2. But with that, I wish you all a wonderful week, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.